Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every person's life when suffering enters uninvited. It takes different forms: betrayal, loss, injustice, rejection. And when it does, the natural impulse is to ask, why me? The world as it appears in that moment is cruel and unfair. And in that moment, something dangerous happens. Pain starts whispering in your ear, tempting you with an idea. Someone must pay for this. Many take the bait. They take their pain and they turn it into a weapon. They wield their suffering against the world, believing that their anguish justifies their cruelty. They become cynical, vengeful, and worst of all, they believe they are right. This is a mistake. History is filled with people who allowed their pain to make them monsters. The ones who were abandoned and in turn abandoned others. The ones who were ridiculed and in turn ridiculed others. The ones who suffered injustice and in turn became the very thing they despised. They did not escape suffering. They became its messengers. And the world burned for it. But there is another way. There is a path that does not lead to tyranny, but to transformation. You must refuse to let your suffering justify your vengeance. You must take responsibility for it, not because it is fair, but because the alternative is far worse. If you do not master your pain, it will master you. And you will wake up one day realizing that the enemy you sought to punish was never them. It was always yourself. True strength is not found in destruction, but in redemption. The highest moral calling is to take your pain and use it to heal, not to wound. To break the cycle. To ensure that no one else suffers as you did. That is the task. That is your responsibility. And that is how you rise above the suffering that once threatened to consume you. The transformation of suffering. Pain is inevitable. At some point in life, suffering will come for you, unannounced and unmerciful. It may arrive through loss, betrayal, failure, or sheer misfortune. And when it does, you will have a choice, whether to let it refine you or let it destroy you. That choice, though it may not seem like it, will define the rest of your life. Suffering in itself is not inherently bad. It is a teacher, a force that can shape a person into something stronger, wiser, more resilient. Many of the greatest individuals in history were forged in suffering. They endured it, faced it, and emerged from it as something greater than before. They learned to carry their pain without allowing it to corrupt them. But suffering is also dangerous. It has the power to twist a person into something bitter, resentful, and even cruel. When pain is left unchecked, when it is not processed or understood, it mutates into something far worse: resentment. And resentment is a poison. It convinces you that your suffering is someone else's fault, that the world owes you for your pain, and that the only way to balance the scales is to make others suffer as well. At first, this mindset feels justified. You've been hurt after all. You have suffered. Why shouldn't others understand what you've been through? Why shouldn't they feel the same pain you felt? It is an intoxicating idea, and many fall into its trap. But the moment you allow your suffering to be an excuse for inflicting pain on others, you have lost control of yourself. You are no longer responding to your suffering. You are becoming its instrument. This is how cycles of pain perpetuate. The abused become abusers, the betrayed become betrayers, the oppressed, when given power, become oppressors. It happens not because people are inherently evil, but because suffering, when not confronted, demands repayment. And so people repay their pain not by healing it, but by passing it on. But there is another way. You do not have to be a prisoner of your suffering. You do not have to let your pain turn you into someone you despise. The real test of character is whether you can carry your suffering without letting it corrupt you. Whether you can take what has happened to you and use it not as a weapon, but as a lesson. And that begins with responsibility. Not responsibility for what happened to you, that is often beyond your control, but responsibility for what you do with it. If you refuse to let suffering turn you into something bitter, you rob it of its power. If you take the lessons your pain has taught you and use them to help others rather than harm them, you break the cycle. This is not an easy path. It requires strength, far more strength than vengeance ever will. But it is the only way forward, because if you let pain dictate your actions, if you allow it to turn you against the world, then you are not punishing those who hurt you. You are only ensuring that their pain lives on through you. Your suffering does not have to define you, but what you do with it will. Victimhood is a weapon. Pain has a strange way of distorting reality. When we suffer, we see the world differently. The colors fade, the warmth disappears, and everything feels hostile. The mind begins to rewrite the past, painting us as the innocent and the world as the aggressor. And in that moment, a dangerous idea takes root. I am the victim, and because of that, I am entitled to retribution. This is where suffering becomes a weapon. Instead of processing pain, people often choose to wield it. They use their suffering as proof that they deserve special treatment, that the rules no longer apply to them, and that they are justified in lashing out. This is the dark side of victimhood. Not the suffering itself, but the transformation of suffering into moral superiority. At first, it feels empowering. Being a victim comes with a form of authority. People listen, they sympathize, they rally behind you, and for a time it feels like justice. But here's the problem. The moment you start using your suffering to manipulate, to control, or to harm others, you are no longer a victim, you are an oppressor in disguise. History is filled with examples of this transformation. Revolutions started by the oppressed only to end in new oppression. People who were once powerless, rising to power and using their pain as a justification for cruelty. The logic is always the same. Because I have suffered, I now have the right to make others suffer. But pain does not grant moral authority. If anything, it places a greater responsibility on you to break the cycle. But breaking the cycle is hard because being a victim feels good. It absolves you of responsibility. It lets you shift the blame onto others, and it provides an easy excuse for inaction. I can't move forward because of what happened to me. But at some point, you must ask yourself, is my pain still real, or am I keeping it alive because it gives me power? This is a brutal question. It requires honesty. It requires looking at your suffering and admitting that, while it was not your fault, it is still your responsibility. If you refuse to let it go, if you choose to hold on to it because it gives you an identity, then you are not healing, you are feeding the wound. The most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who have suffered. They are the ones who have suffered and believe that suffering justifies their actions. The ones who have convinced themselves that their pain makes them righteous and that anyone who challenges them is an enemy. These people are not fighting for justice. They are fighting for revenge. But revenge is a dead end. It does not heal. It does not restore. It only creates more suffering, more resentment, more destruction. The only real path forward is responsibility, not for what happened, but for what happens next. You must choose whether your pain will be a reason to build or a reason to destroy. And that choice will determine not only your future, but the future of everyone around you. So ask yourself, am I carrying my pain or am I using it? One path leads to healing, the other leads to ruin. The choice is yours. Resentment and the path to tyranny. Resentment is a slow poison. It does not strike suddenly like anger. It does not explode like rage. Instead, it simmers, festers, and grows in the dark corners of the mind. It starts as a whisper. This isn't fair. Someone is to blame. And if you listen long enough, it begins to shape your entire reality. Suffering is inevitable, but how you respond to it determines whether it will destroy you or whether you will destroy others. The most dangerous people in history did not start as villains. They started as victims, victims of injustice, rejection, humiliation, and pain. But instead of facing their suffering, they fed it. They let their wounds define them. And over time, their pain turned into hatred. This is how tyranny begins, not with power, but with resentment. The most oppressive leaders, the most ruthless dictators, the cruelest individuals in history all had one thing in common. They were deeply resentful people. They had been hurt, betrayed, or denied what they believed they deserved. And instead of confronting their pain, they let it fuel their vengeance. The logic is always the same. I suffered, and therefore I have the right to make others suffer. It feels justified, it feels fair, but it is not justice. It is destruction masquerading as righteousness. And it is the most seductive lie a person can believe. Look around and you will see this pattern everywhere. The employee who was mistreated now mistreats others the moment they get a promotion. The child who was bullied becomes a bully as soon as they get the chance. The person who was rejected now finds satisfaction in tearing others down. They believe they are balancing the scales, but in reality they are only proving that pain, when left unchecked, replicates itself. And the scariest part? Resentful people do not believe they are dangerous. They believe they are good. They believe they are justified. They believe that because they have suffered, they are morally superior. And once you believe you are morally superior, anything becomes permissible. This is why resentment must be confronted early, before it warps your perception, before it convinces you that the world owes you something, before it turns you into the very thing you once despised. So how do you stop resentment? By telling the truth, by admitting that life is unfair, but that does not give you the right to seek vengeance, by realizing that your pain, no matter how deep, does not justify cruelty, by understanding that you have a choice to let your suffering shape you into someone stronger, or to let it turn you into a tyrant in your own small world. Resentment is a seductive trap because it promises justice, but it never delivers. It only creates more pain, more destruction, more suffering. The path forward is responsibility, not for what happened to you, but for what you do next. You can choose to let go, to rise above, to ensure that no one else suffers as you did. Or you can cling to your pain, feed it, and let it consume you. But know this, the moment you justify your cruelty by pointing to your suffering, you are lost. You are no longer a victim. You are becoming the villain. Owning your pain, there is a harsh truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your pain is your responsibility. Not because you caused it, not because it is fair, but because no one else is going to fix it for you. Suffering happens. It happens unfairly. It happens randomly. And when it does, there is a temptation to wait for justice, for an apology, for someone to acknowledge what you have endured. But waiting is dangerous. It keeps you frozen in place. It gives your pain power over you. And worst of all, it convinces you that your healing is someone else's job. It isn't. If you have been hurt, you have two choices. You can let that pain define you, or you can own it. Owning your pain does not mean pretending it didn't happen. It does not mean ignoring it. It means recognizing that despite what was done to you, you are still responsible for what happens next. This is difficult because pain always comes with a story, and that story is compelling. You tell yourself, I am like this because of what happened to me. My anger, my sadness, my failure, none of it is my fault. And to some extent, that may be true. But here's the problem. As long as you believe that, you are powerless. Because if your suffering is the fault of someone else, then so is your recovery. And that means you are trapped. People who refuse to own their pain stay in the same place for years, sometimes decades. They blame their parents, their teachers, their ex-partners, their circumstances. And as long as they are blaming, they are not growing, they are not changing, they are not moving forward. But the moment you take responsibility, everything shifts. If your life is terrible because of what happened to you, then there's nothing you can do. But if your life is terrible because of how you are responding to it, then you can change. That is a painful realization, but it is also the most liberating truth you will ever encounter, because it means that your suffering is not the final chapter. You are. This does not mean the pain will disappear overnight. Some wounds run deep. Some take years to heal. But healing only begins when you decide that your pain does not get to control you anymore. When you decide that you will not spend your life waiting for an apology that may never come. When you realize that your past does not get to dictate your future unless you let it. So ask yourself, what am I still holding on to? Are you waiting for justice? Are you waiting for someone to admit they were wrong? Are you waiting for life to make it up to you? If so, you are wasting precious time. The person who hurt you may never acknowledge it. The universe may never compensate you, but none of that matters because your healing is not about them. It is about you. Owning your pain is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. It means stepping out of the role of the victim and taking back control. It means saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt. But it does not get to define me anymore. That is how you reclaim your life. That is how you break free. That is how you move forward. Rebuilding instead of destroying. There are two kinds of people who emerge from suffering. The first group takes their pain and uses it as an excuse to destroy trust, relationships, opportunities, even themselves. They let their suffering justify their cruelty, their anger, their lack of responsibility. The second group does something infinitely harder. They take their pain and use it to build. And that choice between destruction and rebuilding is the most important decision you will ever make in response to your suffering. When we experience deep pain, the first instinct is to lash out. It feels like justice. If we have suffered, why shouldn't others? If the world has wronged us, why should we play by its rules? This is the logic of destruction. It is an easy path, but it is also a trap. Because destruction does not fix anything. It only spreads suffering further. Look at history. Look at the people who allowed their pain to define them. Some became tyrants, some became bitter and resentful, some spent their entire lives punishing the world for what it did to them, and at the end of it all, they were still suffering. They won nothing. They built nothing. They simply passed their pain forward, ensuring that others would experience what they did. But then there are those who took their pain and did something remarkable. Instead of using it to destroy, they used it to build. They turned their suffering into wisdom, their wounds into strength. These are the people who, despite everything, refuse to let their pain define them in a way that would make them lesser. Instead, they let it shape them into something greater. The difference between these two groups is not in what happened to them, it is in what they chose to do with it. Destruction is easy, rebuilding is hard. To rebuild after suffering is to say, yes, I was hurt, but I will not use my suffering as an excuse to hurt others. It is to say, yes, I have experienced injustice, but I will not allow it to make me unjust. It is to say, yes, I have been broken, but I will not let that be the final word on who I am. This is not a comfortable path. It is far easier to surrender to destruction. It is easier to justify cruelty by pointing to your pain. But the most meaningful lives, the strongest people, the ones who leave behind something worthwhile, those are the ones who refuse to let their suffering make them small, angry, or bitter. They are the ones who stand back up not just for themselves, but for others. Because the highest moral task is not to pass on your suffering, it is to ensure that no one else has to suffer as you did. So, how do you rebuild instead of destroy? First, you must recognize that pain is not an identity. Many people become addicted to their suffering. It gives them meaning. It gives them a reason to act, a reason to demand, a reason to lash out. But your suffering is not who you are. It is something you went through. If you hold on to it too tightly, you will never be free of it. Second, you must accept that healing is your responsibility. No one is coming to fix you. No one is going to make up for what happened. The world does not work that way. And the longer you wait for justice, the longer you delay your own growth. Healing does not mean forgetting. It does not mean excusing. It means taking responsibility for your own future. Third, you must build something greater than your pain. This is the real antidote to suffering. You cannot erase your past, but you can create something powerful enough to overshadow it. Some people build families, communities, businesses, art, knowledge. They take their pain and use it as fuel to create something beautiful. And in doing so, they prove that suffering does not have the final say. Fourth, you must break the cycle. If you were abandoned, be someone who never abandons. If you were betrayed, be someone who remains loyal. If you were denied kindness, be the one who offers it freely. Every act of goodness in response to pain is an act of rebellion against suffering itself. It is proof that your past does not control you. And finally, you must forgive, not because they deserve it, but because you do. This does not mean excusing what was done to you. It does not mean pretending it did not hurt. It means refusing to let it define your future. Forgiveness is not a gift to the people who hurt you. It is a gift to yourself. It is how you reclaim your own life. Pain is inevitable. What you do with it is not. So when you stand at the crossroads, when suffering tempts you to destroy, to lash out, to become something small and angry, ask yourself, is this who I want to be? You have the power to break the cycle. You have the power to turn your pain into something that does not destroy, but builds. And that is how you rise.